This is the new A7C Mark II. It's the follow-up to one of Sony's strangest cameras, the A7C, a compact full-frame camera that, in my opinion, did not know who its target audience was. 3 years later, Sony has taken some of their newest feature improvements from other cameras and brought them into this smaller form factor. The question I want to answer today is, do all these new improvements give this camera a clearer identity than its predecessor? I can tell you now, from my almost 2 weeks with this camera, I think it manages to be both professional and unprofessional at the same time. Here's why. When I first got this camera in the mail, I remained a bit skeptical of its place in the market. Holding it in the hand for the first time, I didn't get a wow feeling from the compactness. I think this is because, personally, I've never found Sony's other cameras to be that big to begin with. In May, Sony released the ZV-E1, a slightly smaller full-frame camera than this A7C Mark II with the same sensor as the extremely popular Sony A7S III and FX3. Why then release another compact full-frame camera that isn't as small? Well, the A7C Mark II shares the same 33 megapixel sensor as the hugely popular A7 IV. Arguably the best hybrid mirrorless camera on the market, and definitely the camera people seem to compare against when considering a hybrid camera for their work. The A7 IV with a battery and SD card weighs in at 658 grams. The A7C Mark II comes in at 514 grams, which is nearly the same weight as the original A7C. 144 grams doesn't sound like much, and visually it isn't. This weight savings also comes with some clear physical trade-offs, which I will dive into a bit more later in this video. Unlike the A7 IV, the A7C Mark II has a dedicated AI processing unit, which should improve the reliability of the autofocus and allows for the auto framing feature, a newer feature from Sony introduced in the ZV-E1. Since this is the same 33 megapixel sensor as the A7 IV, in the video department we get the same on-paper spec. 10-bit 4K up to 30 FPS that is oversampled from the 7K of the full sensor. This translates to one of the sharpest images on a Sony camera. We also see the same 4K 60 FPS mode that has a 1.5x crop of the full sensor. The first thing I shot with the A7C Mark II was the intro you saw at the beginning of this video. I wanted to see how this camera performed in a commercial-like setting while seeing how far I could push the AI-based autofocus. In my initial test on this shoot, I was blown away by the autofocus. I shot this intro entirely on my own with no camera assistant, and I was able to do shots I would never have dreamed of attempting without an assistant pulling focus. Here's an example. I ran a take of Elaine flipping a tire multiple times. Even though I follow the tire down each time it lands, when I go back up to her, the camera manages to lock onto her immediately despite a darker backlit lighting situation with a lot of haze in the room. Throughout the shoot day, I tried multiple fast push-in shots on a gimbal, and to my surprise, the focus kept up every single time. Even if I had a camera assistant on the day, I don't know that they would have been able to hit every push-in shot with the same level of consistency. This really freed up my mind on the day to focus on shot ideas and lighting instead of worrying about whether my shot was sharp. When shooting solo, this is a huge relief. I didn't experience any issues with overheating with this camera. During my normal use, the body did get quite warm in the hand at times, but I didn't run into any shoot halting issues in my 2 weeks with the camera. The image quality in video coming off this camera is great. Surprisingly, the rolling shutter performance of this camera didn't really bother me. Even with all the handheld shooting I did, I never really found it to be a major issue. A quick explanation for those unaware, rolling shutter is a type of image distortion where you can start to see your subject skew sideways. This is caused by the subject of a shot moving faster than the camera can read off the sensor. I will say, while Sony's color science has drastically improved over the years, I do find myself working a bit harder to get the image to look the way I personally want, compared to other cameras I've used in the past. If you are used to working with Sony's look though, you'll be right at home with this camera. I shot all of my test footage with the active steady shot enabled, and it was pretty good, especially when you aren't walking too fast. I did have a few moments where I felt the slightly jarring IBIS adjustment when tilting up and down in small amounts. I think the standard mode would have fit my personal shooting style more, but I often end up turning off IBIS entirely depending on the needs of the shoot. Since this is a hybrid camera, I spent half my time with it shooting stills. My experience with the A7C Mark II's EVF was that it's good enough. It's a little small, but is sharp enough to frame shots outdoors. Even with glasses, I'd rather have it than have no EVF at all, like on the ZV-E1. Shooting stills was where I really started to feel the compactness of the A7C Mark II come in. The flat top design paired with a fairly significant grip for a small camera really made it easy to walk around with, even with the large G Master II lenses that I used during my testing. It doesn't look like a professional camera because of its size and the lack of mid-body EVF. This can work to your advantage if you're doing something like street photography, because this camera by default just looks more unassuming. Mentally, I found myself taking this camera with me everywhere as is, without the desire or need to bring a backpack. It just worked well as a daily walk around camera. I never dreaded taking it on a walk or into the city, which to me is a clear indication that despite my middling reaction to the size at first, these subtle differences to a full-size camera add up. Autofocus performance when shooting stills was top-notch. It managed to keep my fast-moving son in focus no matter how quickly he ran at or away from me, something that I'm sure every parent out there would appreciate. I did find a couple of times when the focus area was set to wide or zone with continuous autofocus that the recognition struggled a bit with non-human subjects. This black squirrel evaded the lock-on autofocus between shots, and I found this to be true when I tried shooting a few bees landing on flowers. The autofocus was not quite able to lock onto the bee 100% of the time as it moved from flower to flower. This is not at all poor performance, just something I noticed during my use. No camera I have ever used has ever delivered a perfect result in situations like this. The combination of this camera and both Sony G Master lenses that I had to test produced some of the sharpest, cleanest stills I've ever shot. Sony knows how to deliver a pristine, professional looking image straight out of the camera. That being said, every time I have shot stills with a Sony camera, I've always felt like something was missing. This isn't really quantifiable, but the look that Sony's cameras provide to me has always felt almost too perfect for years. This is purely a personal observation, and I think that most people out there would be really happy with the look of this camera. All cameras these days are so good that I'm just splitting hairs at this point. If you put in the time to find a look that you want, this camera will deliver great results. Unfortunately, since I have this camera early, I couldn't edit the raw files in Lightroom since the third-party profiles were not available. So I processed the RAWs in Sony's Imaging Edge and edited the exports from that in Lightroom for overall color and look. The physical trade-offs this camera makes to hit this compact size definitely had me missing a larger camera at times. I like to shoot stills with a spot focus point that I move around, and because this camera lacks a joystick, you are forced to use the D-pad to move this focus point around. The focus point can be locked and unlocked with a press of the center button. This process does not feel very intuitive. During my use, I found the focus point would be locked when I didn't want it to be, and or moved to the corner of the frame, focusing on something I did not want. Rarely did I put the camera to my eye and have the focus point be in the right part of the frame for my shot. I definitely miss shots because of this process, and it's something I wouldn't experience on a larger camera with a joystick where I could move the focus point really quickly. If you prefer to shoot in zone or in wide focus area, this probably would be a non-issue. I've just found in my experience that no matter how good the autofocus system is, neither of those options has consistently focused on exactly what I want in the frame every single time. I am glad that the selection dial for the S&Q video and photo modes that was introduced on the A7 IV was kept here, because switching between shooting stills and video was a fairly seamless experience. I wish that by default the video and photo mode settings were set separately, because at first I thought you were stuck with the same settings for each mode, but there is an option in the menu that allows them to be separate. The rest of the body of this camera is pretty well thought out. There are just enough buttons and dials that I never felt like I was missing an essential control in my use. The I/O on the left of the camera is laid out for optimal movement of the flip-out display even when all ports are used, which I appreciate. I am not a fan of the inclusion of micro HDMI and the single SD card slot, despite understanding the necessity. I will forever hate micro HDMI because it is such a fragile connector, and the lack of media redundancy would give me pause to rely on this camera in a high stakes professional setting. You will also need fast cards to use this camera. I used Sabrent's 256 gig V90 cards throughout my testing to keep up with the high bitrate video. On a 256 gig card, I got about 2 hours and 17 minutes of 4K 24 FPS in the all intra record setting. The battery this camera uses is the tried and true Sony FZ100. This is my first experience where I actually enjoyed using the touch controls on a Sony camera. The exposure settings were easy to use, it felt smooth and easy to do. You also have the option to change most of your settings without pressing or using a single dial on the camera. Personally, I still prefer buttons and dials, but it is nice that you have the option. I found it most helpful for changing settings like white balance and drive mode. I will say though that the display can feel a bit cluttered if you have both sides of the touch controls on. This is not really a big deal since you have the option to turn them off to suit your needs. By the end of my time with it, I really started to enjoy using the A7C Mark II. This camera delivers professional looking videos and photos in a body that doesn't look like a professional camera and has the physical quirks of what I would classify as an enthusiast camera. The fewer button controls, lack of a joystick, single SD card slot, and micro HDMI port are all tiny details that would prevent me from using this camera professionally. So who is the target audience for a camera that can deliver a professional look without some of the physical professional features? My best answer is this. I think if you already own a full frame Sony body and you shoot a lot of photos and videos at the same time and you want a secondary camera that is smaller, or if you are a content creator just starting out or an enthusiast who prefers a smaller everyday camera because you travel a lot or you want it to be a bit more conspicuous when you're out in public, then I think this camera would serve you well. I will admit that the A7C Mark II and the A7C-R, along with the ZV-E1, are all interesting additions to Sony's lineup this year because they are all taking the best from larger cameras and putting them into smaller packages, a product development approach Sony has been doing for years. It's also a good sign that the next generation of cameras will only push the limits further. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, you might also enjoy my last camera review, the Fujifilm X-H2S, the camera I currently use for YouTube. See you next time.